The words hit me like a physical blow. "Scarlett, you are no longer family." My sister Madison spoke with the cold finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. Around the mahogany dining table, our relatives nodded in agreement, their faces masks of righteous indignation. 23 years of shared memories, holidays, and late-night conversations reduced to nothing. What had I done? I had asked one simple question about our grandmother's missing inheritance. Now, sitting in stunned silence, I realized this reaction meant I had stumbled onto something much darker than anyone wanted me to discover. Before we dive into how my own blood turned against me for seeking the truth, I need to ask, where are you watching from today? If this story of family betrayal hits close to home, please hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next will show you exactly how far family members will go to protect their darkest secrets. Trust me, you will want to see how this ends. 3 weeks before that devastating dinner, I had been living in blissful ignorance about my family's true nature. As a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, I specialized in uncovering financial fraud, but I never imagined my skills would become necessary within my own bloodline. It all started when I received a call from our family lawyer, Harold Pemberton. Grandmother Rose had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving behind what we all believed was a modest estate. However, Harold informed me that there were significant discrepancies in the inheritance documentation that required immediate attention. "Scarlett, I need to meet with you privately," Harold said, his voice unusually grave. "There are some irregularities regarding your grandmother's assets that I cannot discuss over the phone." The next morning, I sat across from Harold in his oak-paneled office, watching him shuffle through a thick stack of documents. His normally composed demeanor showed cracks of genuine concern. "Your grandmother was far wealthier than anyone in your family realized." He began removing his glasses to clean them nervously. "When she passed, her estate was valued at approximately $2.7 million. However, according to these bank statements I recently obtained, significant transfers were made in the months leading up to her death." My heart began racing. "What kind of transfers?" Harold spread several bank statements across his desk. "Between January and her death in March, nearly $1.9 million was moved from her accounts. The transfers were authorized by someone with power of attorney." I leaned forward, studying the documents. My grandmother had always been sharp as a tack managing her own finances until the very end. She had built her wealth through decades of shrewd real estate investments and careful saving, always telling us that money was meant to provide security, not luxury. "Who had power of attorney?" I asked, though something in my stomach already knew the answer would change everything. "Your sister Madison and your Uncle Frank," Harold replied. "They obtained it last December, claiming your grandmother was showing signs of cognitive decline." The revelation struck me like a thunderbolt. I had visited Grandmother Rose regularly up until her death, and she had been as mentally sharp as ever. We had discussed current events, played complex card games, and she had even helped me with a particularly challenging work project involving investment fraud detection. There had been absolutely no signs of cognitive decline. "Harold, I need to see all the documentation," I said, my professional instincts kicking into high gear. "Bank statements, the power of attorney paperwork, medical records if available, and any correspondence related to these transfers." Harold nodded grimly. "I was hoping you would say that. Your grandmother specifically mentioned in conversations with me that if anything seemed suspicious about her estate, you were the only family member she trusted to investigate. She always said you had inherited her instinct for sniffing out deception." Over the next 2 weeks, I dove deep into the financial records Harold provided. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The transfers had not been random withdrawals, but strategic asset liquidations. Madison and Uncle Frank had systematically converted Grandmother Rose's investment portfolio into cash, then moved the money into accounts I could not immediately trace. The more I investigated, the more sophisticated the scheme appeared. They had used multiple shell companies and offshore accounts to obscure the money trail. This was not impulsive greed, but a carefully orchestrated plan that had been months in the making. The most damning evidence came in the form of email correspondence Harold had discovered between Madison and Uncle Frank. In these messages, they discussed convincing the old bat she is losing her mind and making sure Scarlett stays out of our business. They had manipulated our grandmother into believing she was becoming forgetful, gaslighting her into signing over financial control. One email from Madison to Uncle Frank particularly chilled me. Once we have the money secured, we need to make sure Scarlett never finds out what really happened. She is too smart and too stubborn. If she starts investigating, we could lose everything. But the most heartbreaking discovery was a handwritten note I found among Grandmother Rose's personal effects that Harold had saved for me. In her familiar, neat handwriting, she had written, "I am not losing my mind, but Madison and Frank keep telling me I am forgetting things. They say I need help managing my money. I am scared and confused. I wish I could talk to Scarlett, but they say she is too busy to visit." Reading those words, I realized my sister and uncle had deliberately isolated our grandmother from me during her final months, feeding her lies about my supposed unavailability while systematically stealing her life savings. They had not just committed financial fraud, they had emotionally abused a vulnerable elderly woman in her final months of life. The evidence was overwhelming. But I knew confronting Madison and Uncle Frank directly would only give them time to cover their tracks further. I needed a strategy that would expose their crimes and ensure they faced appropriate consequences. That evening, I called my cousin David, Uncle Frank's son, whom I had always considered one of the more honest family members. I carefully shared some of what I had discovered watching his reaction closely. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," I said. "Have you noticed anything unusual about your father's finances lately? Any sudden improvements in his lifestyle or unexplained purchases?" David was quiet for a long moment. "Actually, yes. Dad just bought a brand new truck, paid cash for it, and he and Mom have been talking about taking a European vacation this summer. I thought it was strange because Dad has always been so careful with money, but when I asked about it, he just said he had made some good investments." The pieces were falling into place. Madison and Uncle Frank had not just stolen Grandmother Rose's money, they were already spending it confident that their crime would never be discovered. They had underestimated two crucial factors: Grandmother Rose's foresight in alerting Harold to watch for suspicious activity, and my professional expertise in exactly this type of financial investigation. As I prepared to take action, I realized this was about more than money. This was about justice for an elderly woman who had been betrayed by the people she trusted most, and about ensuring that Madison and Uncle Frank faced consequences for their calculated cruelty. Armed with irrefutable evidence, I decided the time had come to expose Madison and Uncle Frank's elaborate theft. However, I knew I needed to be strategic about how I approached this confrontation. These were not ordinary criminals, but family members who had spent months planning their crime and would likely have contingency plans for damage control. I arranged to meet with Harold first, laying out my findings and discussing the best legal approach. Harold reviewed my analysis with the thoroughness of someone who had practiced law for over 30 years. "Scarlett, this is one of the most comprehensive financial fraud investigations I have ever seen," Harold said, his voice filled with both admiration and sadness. "You have documented a clear pattern of elder abuse, financial manipulation, and theft. The evidence you have gathered would be sufficient for criminal prosecution." However, Harold also warned me about the challenges ahead. Family financial crimes are often the most difficult to prosecute because victims are reluctant to testify against relatives, and juries sometimes view these cases as family disputes rather than serious crimes. We decided on a two-pronged approach. First, I would confront Madison and Uncle Frank privately, giving them an opportunity to return the stolen funds and admit their wrongdoing. If they refused, we would immediately file criminal charges and civil suits to recover the assets. The confrontation took place on a Saturday afternoon at Madison's house. I had requested a family meeting, telling Madison I wanted to discuss some questions about Grandmother Rose's estate. Madison, Uncle Frank, and his wife, Aunt Carol, were present, all appearing relaxed and confident. "I am glad you called this meeting, Scarlett," Madison began with a patronizing smile. "Frank and I have been concerned that you might have unrealistic expectations about Grandmother Rose's estate. The truth is, she had far less money than any of us realized." Uncle Frank nodded solemnly. "Rose was generous to a fault in her final years. She made several large charitable donations and spent considerable money on medical care. By the time she passed, there was not much left to distribute. I listened to their lies with growing anger, but I maintained my composure. These were the same people who had spent months gaslighting our grandmother, and now they were trying the same manipulation tactics on me. That is interesting. I replied calmly, pulling out a thick folder of documents. Because I have been working with Harold to review Grandmother Rose's financial records, and I discovered some fascinating information. The change in their expressions was immediate and dramatic. Madison's confident smile vanished, replaced by a look of alarm. Uncle Frank straightened in his chair, his face paling noticeably. "What kind of information?" Madison asked, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. I opened the folder and began laying out bank statements, transfer records, and email printouts across Madison's coffee table. Well, for starters, I discovered that Grandmother Rose was worth approximately $2.7 million at the time of her death, not the few $1,000s you claimed. Aunt Carol gasped audibly while Uncle Frank and Madison exchanged a look of pure terror. I also found records showing that nearly $2 million was transferred out of her accounts in the months before her death. I continued watching their faces carefully. These transfers were authorized using a power of attorney that you obtained by convincing Grandmother Rose she was losing her mental faculties. "Scarlett, you do not understand," Madison said, her voice now desperate and pleading. "Grandmother Rose asked us to help manage her finances." She was becoming confused and making poor decisions. I pulled out the handwritten note from Grandmother Rose and placed it in the center of the table. "Then explain this note where she writes about not losing her mind, but being told by you and Frank that she was forgetting things. Explain how she writes about being scared and confused by your manipulation." The silence that followed was deafening. Uncle Frank's face had turned ashen and Madison's hands were visibly shaking. "I also have copies of email correspondence between the two of you," I continued relentlessly. "Emails where you discuss convincing the old bat she is losing her mind and making sure I stay out of your business." At this point, Uncle Frank attempted to take control of the situation. "Scarlett, even if there are some irregularities, this is a family matter. We can work this out privately without involving outsiders." I looked him directly in the eyes. "Frank, you and Madison committed elder abuse and financial fraud against a vulnerable woman. This stopped being a family matter the moment you decided to steal from Grandmother Rose and emotionally torture her in her final months." Madison suddenly shifted tactics, her desperation transforming into anger. "You always thought you were so much smarter than the rest of us, didn't you, Scarlett? Always the perfect granddaughter, always Grandmother Rose's favorite. Well, maybe it is time someone knocked you down a peg." "Madison, I am giving you one opportunity to do the right thing," I replied firmly. "Return the money you stole, admit what you did, and we can handle this within the family. If you refuse, Harold and I will file criminal charges on Monday morning." Uncle Frank and Madison whispered frantically to each other for several minutes while Aunt Carol sat in stunned silence. Finally, Madison turned back to me with a look of cold fury. "We are not returning anything and we are not admitting to anything," she declared. "If you want to tear this family apart over money, that is your choice, but do not expect us to make it easy for you." Uncle Frank nodded in agreement. "You have always been jealous that Madison and I were closer to Rose in her final years. This is just your way of trying to cause trouble because you were left out." Their complete lack of remorse and continued attempts at manipulation confirmed what I had suspected. They felt no guilt about what they had done and would continue lying to protect themselves. "In that case," I said, gathering up my documents, "you will be hearing from the police very soon. I hope the money was worth destroying your relationship with Grandmother Rose and losing your freedom." As I prepared to leave, Madison delivered her final blow. "If you go through with this, Scarlett, you will regret it. This family will never forgive you for what you are about to do. You will find yourself completely alone." I turned back to face her one final time. "Madison, I would rather be alone with a clear conscience than surrounded by family members who are thieves and abusers. Grandmother Rose trusted you, and you betrayed that trust in the most despicable way possible." Walking out of Madison's house that day, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. I was sad that it had come to this, but determined to ensure that Grandmother Rose received the justice she deserved. I had no idea that Madison's threat about family consequences was about to become a brutal reality. The Monday morning after my confrontation with Madison and Uncle Frank, Harold and I walked into the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department to file formal charges. Detective Maria Santos, a veteran investigator specializing in financial crimes, reviewed our evidence with the intensity of someone who had seen too many families destroyed by greed. "This is one of the most thoroughly documented elder abuse cases I have encountered," Detective Santos said, flipping through the financial records I had compiled. "You have done exceptional work gathering this evidence, Miss Scarlett. However, I need to warn you that family members often face significant retaliation when they report relatives for financial crimes." Detective Santos's warning proved prophetic faster than I could have imagined. Within hours of filing the police report, my phone began ringing with calls from family members I had not heard from in months. The first call came from my cousin Jennifer Madison's daughter. "Scarlett, what the hell do you think you are doing?" Jennifer screamed into the phone. "Mom called me crying, saying you have accused her and Uncle Frank of stealing from Grandmother Rose. This is insane. Mom would never do something like that." I attempted to explain the evidence I had discovered, but Jennifer refused to listen. "I do not care what paperwork you think you found. Mom loved Grandmother Rose more than anyone. You are just jealous because you were not involved in taking care of her at the end." The irony of Jennifer's accusation was not lost on me. Madison and Uncle Frank had deliberately prevented me from being involved in Grandmother Rose's care specifically so they could manipulate her without interference. Over the next few days, the calls continued. Uncle Frank's other children, David and Rebecca, initially seemed more open to hearing my side of the story. David, whom I had confided in earlier, appeared particularly conflicted. "Scarlett, I believe you when you say something suspicious happened," David said during a long phone conversation. "But Dad is still my father. I cannot just assume he is guilty of something this serious without being absolutely certain." I offered to share the evidence with David, hoping that seeing the documentation would help him understand the gravity of what his father had done. However, before David could review the materials, Uncle Frank intervened. "Dad sat me down and explained everything." David called to tell me a few days later, his tone noticeably cooler. He said Grandmother Rose had specifically asked him and Madison to handle her finances because she was worried about making mistakes. "He said you misunderstood some routine financial management as theft." The speed with which Uncle Frank had managed to manipulate David's perception of events demonstrated exactly the same gaslighting techniques he had used on Grandmother Rose. It was both infuriating and heartbreaking to watch him successfully employ the same tactics on his own son. Meanwhile, Detective Santos had begun her official investigation. She interviewed Harold extensively about his conversations with Grandmother Rose and his discovery of the financial irregularities. She also obtained additional bank records and began tracing the money trail I had started mapping. "The evidence you provided has opened several new avenues of investigation," Detective Santos informed me during a follow-up meeting. "We have discovered that the shell companies used to hide the stolen funds are connected to other suspicious financial activities. This may be part of a larger pattern of fraud." However, the detective also shared concerning news about the family's response to the investigation. "Your sister Madison has hired a very expensive criminal defense attorney, someone who specializes in white-collar crimes. She clearly understands the seriousness of the charges she is facing." The investigation intensified when Detective Santos interviewed several of Grandmother Rose's former neighbors and friends. These conversations revealed disturbing details about Madison and Uncle Frank's behavior during Grandmother Rose's final months. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived next door to Grandmother Rose for 15 years, provided particularly damaging testimony. "Rose was sharp as a tack right up until she passed," Mrs. Patterson told Detective Santos. "But in her last few months, she seemed increasingly isolated and confused. Madison and Frank were always at our house, and Rose started canceling our regular coffee meetings, saying she was too tired or too confused to visit." Another neighbor, Mr. Williams, reported seeing Madison and Uncle Frank removing boxes of documents and personal items from Grandmother Rose's house immediately after her funeral. "It struck me as odd because they seemed to be in such a hurry," he told the detective. "When I offered to help, they said they did not need assistance and actually seemed annoyed that I had noticed." These witness statements corroborated my theory that Madison and Uncle Frank had systematically isolated Grandmother Rose from her support network while executing their theft. They had not only stolen her money, but had also stolen her final months of independence and dignity. As the investigation progressed, I found myself increasingly isolated from my extended family. The divide that had started with Madison and Uncle Frank's children quickly spread to other relatives. At family gatherings, I was no longer invited to sides were being chosen. And unfortunately, most family members chose to believe Madison and Uncle Frank's version of events, rather than face the uncomfortable truth about what had really happened. My Aunt Susan, Uncle Frank's sister, called to express her disappointment in my actions. "Scarlett, I understand you might have concerns about Grandmother Rose's estate, but involving the police was completely unnecessary," she said. "These things should be handled within the family, not dragged through the courts for everyone to see." The family's response revealed something troubling about their values. They were more concerned about avoiding public embarrassment than ensuring justice for Grandmother Rose. The idea that elder abuse and theft were serious crimes that deserved legal consequences seemed foreign to them. However, not everyone in the family sided against me. My second cousin Angela, who lived in California and had minimal contact with the local family drama, called to offer her support after hearing about the situation through the family grapevine. "Scarlett, I want you to know that what you are doing takes incredible courage," Angela said. "I remember how sharp and independent Grandmother Rose was. If you say something suspicious happened, I believe you. Too many families sweep these things under the rug and the victims never get justice." Angela's support meant more to me than she could have known. In the growing storm of family condemnation, having even one relative who believed in my cause provided essential emotional stability. Detective Santos also connected me with Margaret Thompson, a victim advocate who specialized in elder abuse cases. Margaret had worked with dozens of families dealing with similar situations and offered valuable perspective on what I could expect moving forward. "Family financial abuse cases often follow predictable patterns," Margaret explained during our first meeting. "The perpetrators usually have strong family support because relatives find it easier to blame the whistleblower than acknowledge that people they love are capable of such betrayal." Margaret also warned me about the emotional toll the investigation and potential trial would take. "You are fighting not just for money, but for your grandmother's dignity and memory. That is noble, but it will be exhausting. You need to build a support network of people who understand what you are trying to accomplish." Taking Margaret's advice, I began attending a support group for family members dealing with financial elder abuse. Hearing stories from other people who had faced similar situations helped me realize that my experience was not unique. Unfortunately, elder abuse by family members was far more common than most people realized. One group member, Patricia, had dealt with a situation remarkably similar to mine. Her brother had stolen nearly $500,000 from their mother while claiming to help manage her finances. "The hardest part was not the money," Patricia shared. "It was watching family members who knew the truth choose to support my brother because it was easier than admitting they had been fooled." As winter turned to spring, Detective Santos informed me that the district attorney's office had decided to pursue criminal charges against Madison and Uncle Frank. The evidence of elder abuse and financial fraud was too compelling to ignore, despite the family's attempts to characterize the situation as a misunderstanding. "They will be arrested within the next 2 weeks," Detective Santos told me. "I wanted to give you advance warning because this will likely escalate the family conflict significantly." She was right. The day Madison and Uncle Frank were arrested, my phone exploded with angry calls and text messages from family members. The accusations ranged from claims that I was money hungry to suggestions that I was mentally unstable and seeking attention. Madison's final text message to me that day was particularly vicious. "You have destroyed this family over money, Scarlett. I hope you are satisfied. You will never be welcome among us again." Reading that message, I realized that the little girl who had once looked up to her big sister was officially gone forever. Madison had chosen greed over family lies, over truth, and cruelty over compassion. The person I thought I knew had never really existed, but as painful as the family rejection was, I knew I had made the right choice. Grandmother Rose deserved justice, and I was the only family member willing to fight for it. The truth was on my side, and eventually that would have to be enough. 6 months into the criminal investigation, I believed I had built a solid foundation of support. Detective Santos had assembled an airtight case. Harold remained steadfast in his commitment to seeing justice served, and Margaret Thompson continued providing invaluable guidance through the legal maze ahead. However, I was about to learn that even the most trusted allies could become sources of devastating betrayal. The first crack in my support system appeared during what should have been a routine case update meeting. Margaret Thompson, the victim advocate who had become not just my professional guide, but someone I considered a close friend, seemed unusually nervous as we sat in her office reviewing the prosecution's timeline. "Scarlett, I need to discuss something important with you," Margaret began, avoiding direct eye contact for the first time since we had met. "I have been approached by Madison's defense attorney with some information that could significantly impact your case." My stomach immediately clenched with dread. Margaret's tone carried a formality that had never existed in our previous conversations, and her body language suggested she was preparing to deliver devastating news. "What kind of information?" I asked, though part of me did not want to hear the answer. Margaret pulled out a thick manila folder and placed it on the desk between us. "Madison's legal team has obtained financial records showing that you received significant payments from your grandmother in the 2 years before her death. They are claiming that you were also receiving money inappropriately and that your accusations against Madison and Frank are an attempt to deflect attention from your own financial misconduct." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "Margaret, that is completely false. Yes, Grandmother Rose helped me with some expenses when I was completing my graduate degree, but those were gifts, not theft. She insisted on helping with my education costs because she believed in investing in family." Margaret nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I understand, and I believe you. However, Madison's attorney has presented these payments in a way that makes them appear suspicious. They are arguing that you had as much access to your grandmother's finances as Madison and Frank did." The implication was clear. Madison's defense strategy involved painting me as equally guilty of financial exploitation, thereby undermining my credibility as a witness and victim advocate. "Margaret, you have seen all the evidence," I said, my voice rising with frustration. "You know the difference between legitimate gifts and the systematic theft that Madison and Frank committed. How can you even entertain this false equivalence?" Margaret's next words shattered whatever trust remained between us. "Scarlett, I think it might be in your best interest to consider reaching a settlement with Madison and Frank rather than pursuing criminal charges. Family financial disputes rarely end well for anyone involved, and now that questions have been raised about your own conduct, continuing this fight could damage your professional reputation." I stared at Margaret in disbelief. This was the same woman who had spent months encouraging me to seek justice for Grandmother Rose, who had praised my courage in standing up to family pressure, who had connected me with other elder abuse victims to show me I was not alone. Now she was suggesting I abandon the fight just when Madison's desperation had led to false accusations against me. "Margaret, I cannot believe you are suggesting I back down now," I said, my voice trembling with both anger and betrayal. "Grandmother Rose deserves justice regardless of what lies Madison's attorney wants to spread about me." Margaret's response revealed the extent of her betrayal. "Scarlett, I have to think about my own professional reputation as well. If this case becomes too controversial, it could affect my ability to help other victims in the future. Sometimes the most practical solution is not the most satisfying one." The realization that Margaret was more concerned about her professional image than seeking justice for my grandmother was devastating. I had trusted her completely, shared my most vulnerable moments during this fight, and believed she genuinely cared about the outcome. Instead, she was willing to abandon the case the moment it became personally inconvenient. The betrayal deepened when I discovered that Margaret had been discussing my case with Madison's defense attorney without my knowledge or consent. Harold informed me of this development during an emergency meeting at his office. "Scarlett, I learned from the prosecutor that Margaret has been providing information to Madison's legal team under the guise of exploring settlement options." Harold explained, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Some of the confidential details about your emotional state and family relationships that you shared with her have found their way into Madison's defense strategy." The violation of trust was almost unbearable. Margaret had not just abandoned my cause. She had actively undermined it by sharing privileged information with the opposing side. Everything I had told her about my grief over losing Grandmother Rose, my pain at family rejection, and my fears about the legal process ahead had been weaponized against me. The impact of Margaret's betrayal extended beyond emotional hurt. The defense attorney now possessed intimate knowledge of my psychological vulnerabilities and was using that information to craft arguments designed to break my resolve. Madison's legal team began demanding extensive financial records from my personal accounts, claiming they needed to investigate the full scope of inappropriate financial relationships within the family. Detective Santos, who had remained my most reliable ally, expressed her own frustration with Margaret's conduct. What she did was professionally unethical and personally despicable. Detective Santos told me during a private conversation. However, we cannot let her betrayal derail the investigation. The evidence against Madison and Frank stands on its own merit regardless of Margaret's cooperation with the defense. But the damage had already been done. The stress of fighting both the original case and the new false accusations took a severe toll on my mental and physical health. I began experiencing panic attacks, insomnia, and periods of profound depression that made it difficult to function normally. The family rejection, which had been painful but manageable, became exponentially more difficult to bear when combined with Margaret's betrayal. I felt completely alone in a fight that seemed to grow more complicated and hostile with each passing day. Madison's defense attorney capitalized on my vulnerable state by demanding that I undergo psychological evaluation to determine my fitness to serve as a credible witness. The suggestion that I was mentally unstable added insult to injury, particularly since my emotional distress was a direct result of the trauma Madison and Frank had inflicted on our family. The lowest point came when I learned that Margaret had also been providing information to other family members, further poisoning the well of potential support. Relatives who had remained neutral in the family conflict now viewed me with suspicion, wondering if my accusations against Madison and Frank were motivated by my own guilt over financial misconduct. Late one evening, sitting alone in my apartment surrounded by legal documents and financial records, I seriously considered abandoning the fight. The personal cost of seeking justice had become almost unbearable, and Margaret's betrayal had shown me that even people I trusted completely could turn against me when the stakes became too high. However, as I looked at Grandmother Rose's handwritten note describing her confusion and fear during her final months, I realized that giving up would mean her suffering had been meaningless. Margaret's betrayal was devastating, but it did not change the fundamental truth of what Madison and Frank had done to a vulnerable elderly woman. I called Harold and Detective Santos to arrange a meeting for the following morning. If I was going to continue this fight, I needed to do it with complete honesty about the challenges ahead and absolute commitment to seeing it through regardless of who else might abandon the cause along the way. Just when my situation seemed hopeless, salvation arrived from the most unexpected source. 2 days after my meeting with Harold and Detective Santos to recommit to the case despite Margaret's betrayal, I received a phone call that would change everything. "Miss Scarlett, this is Ryan Mitchell from the Federal Bureau of Investigation," the voice on the other end said. "I understand you have been investigating financial crimes involving your family members. We would like to discuss your case because it may be connected to a larger investigation we are conducting." My heart began racing. The involvement of federal law enforcement suggested that Madison and Frank's crimes were far more extensive than I had realized. Agent Mitchell arranged to meet with me, Harold, and Detective Santos at the FBI field office in Charlotte. Walking into that imposing federal building, I felt a mixture of hope and terror about what we might discover. Agent Mitchell was a soft-spoken man in his early 40s who specialized in elder abuse and financial fraud cases. His calm demeanor and obvious expertise immediately inspired confidence that had been severely shaken by Margaret's betrayal. "Miss Scarlett, your investigation has uncovered what we believe is part of a multi-state elder abuse ring," Agent Mitchell explained as he spread several case files across the conference table. "Madison and Frank have been using the same tactics on other elderly victims throughout North Carolina and South Carolina." The revelation was staggering. I had assumed Madison and Frank's theft from Grandmother Rose was an isolated crime of opportunity. Instead, they had been operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise targeting vulnerable elderly people across multiple jurisdictions. Agent Mitchell showed us evidence connecting Madison and Frank to at least 7 other cases of elder abuse. In each instance, they had used variations of the same playbook, gaining power of attorney through manipulation and false claims of cognitive decline, systematically liquidating assets and moving money through shell companies to obscure the theft. "How did you discover this pattern?" Harold asked clearly, as shocked as I was by the scope of the crimes. "We started investigating after receiving reports from several banking institutions about suspicious financial activity," Agent Mitchell explained. "Banks are required to report certain types of transactions that might indicate elder abuse, and we began noticing similarities in the methods being used across different cases." The federal investigation had been ongoing for 8 months, beginning shortly after Grandmother Rose's death. Madison and Frank had been under surveillance for much of the time I had been building my own case against them. "Your investigation actually provided crucial evidence that helped us understand their full operation," Agent Mitchell told me. "The documentation you compiled and the timeline you established filled in several gaps in our understanding of how they target and manipulate their victims." But Agent Mitchell's most important revelation concerned the money Madison and Frank had stolen from Grandmother Rose. "We have been able to trace most of the funds to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland," he said. "Unlike local prosecutors who might struggle to recover international assets, federal law enforcement has tools and partnerships that make recovery much more likely." The federal case also meant that Madison and Frank would face far more serious charges than what the local district attorney could pursue. Instead of state-level elder abuse charges, they would be prosecuted under federal racketeering laws that carried potential sentences of decades in prison. Agent Mitchell introduced me to Special Agent Sarah Kim, a financial crimes specialist who had been tracking the money trail for months. Agent Kim's expertise in international finance made my forensic accounting skills look elementary by comparison. "Madison and Frank made one crucial mistake that allowed us to crack their entire operation," Agent Kim explained. "They used the same shell company structure for multiple victims, thinking that keeping the crimes in different states would prevent law enforcement from connecting the cases." Agent Kim showed me flowcharts and financial diagrams that revealed the true sophistication of Madison and Frank's criminal enterprise. They had been stealing from elderly victims for nearly 3 years, accumulating millions of dollars in ill-gotten gains. "Your grandmother was unfortunately not their first victim, but she appears to have been one of their largest scores," Agent Kim continued. "The methods they used on her were refined versions of techniques they had tested on other victims." Learning that Grandmother Rose had been targeted as part of a calculated criminal enterprise rather than a spontaneous family betrayal was both heartbreaking and validating. It confirmed that my instincts about the premeditated nature of their crimes had been correct. The federal investigation also revealed connections between Madison and Frank's operation and Margaret Thompson, my former victim advocate. Agent Mitchell explained that Margaret had been receiving payments from a consulting firm that was secretly funded by defense attorneys representing elder abuse perpetrators. Margaret Thompson was essentially being paid to undermine elder abuse cases by encouraging victims' families to accept settlements rather than pursue criminal prosecution, Agent Mitchell revealed. "Her betrayal of your trust was not personal weakness, but part of a larger corruption scheme." This revelation transformed my understanding of Margaret's betrayal. She had not simply abandoned my case due to personal cowardice. She had been actively working against elder abuse victims while pretending to advocate for them. Agent Kim also provided encouraging news about asset recovery. "Because we can prove that Madison and Frank's entire operation was criminal, we can seize all assets they acquired using proceeds from their crimes," she explained. "This includes not just the money stolen from your grandmother, but also property vehicles and other purchases they made with stolen funds." The federal case moved with remarkable speed once the investigation became public. Within 2 weeks of my meeting with Agent Mitchell, Madison and Frank were arrested again, this time on federal charges that made their previous state charges seem minor by comparison. The federal prosecution team, led by Assistant United States Attorney Jennifer Walsh, possessed resources and expertise that dwarfed what local prosecutors could bring to bear. They had wiretap evidence, financial forensics, and cooperation from international law enforcement agencies. Most importantly, for me personally, the federal case meant that Madison and Frank's defense strategy of attacking my credibility became irrelevant. The prosecution did not need to rely primarily on my testimony because they had independent evidence of criminal activity spanning multiple victims and several years. Attorney Walsh met with me to explain how the federal case would proceed. "Your role will be important but not central," she explained. "You will testify about your grandmother's case, but the jury will also hear from other victims and see documentary evidence that proves the defendant's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt." The federal investigation also provided something I had desperately needed throughout this ordeal: validation that I had been right to pursue justice despite family pressure and personal betrayal. Agent Mitchell specifically praised my investigative work and determination. "Miss Scarlett, your refusal to accept the initial cover story and your thorough documentation of the financial crimes were instrumental in exposing this entire operation," Agent Mitchell told me. "Without your work, Madison and Frank might have continued victimizing elderly people for years." As winter approached the federal case against Madison, and Frank was scheduled for trial. Unlike the uncertain local prosecution that had seemed vulnerable to defense tactics and family pressure, the federal case appeared virtually certain to result in convictions and lengthy prison sentences. For the first time in nearly a year, I felt genuine hope that Grandmother Rose would receive the justice she deserved, and that other potential victims would be protected from Madison and Frank's predatory crimes. The federal trial began on a cold February morning, exactly 1 year after I had first learned about the financial irregularities in Grandmother Rose's estate. Sitting in the federal courthouse watching Madison and Frank enter in handcuffs and orange jumpsuits, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, sadness, and relief. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness and clarity. Assistant United States Attorney Jennifer Walsh methodically presented evidence spanning 3 years of criminal activity, 7 elderly victims, and millions of dollars in stolen assets. The jury heard recordings of Madison and Frank discussing their manipulation tactics, saw financial records documenting systematic theft, and listened to heartbreaking testimony from other victims' families. When my turn came to testify, I spoke directly to the jury about Grandmother Rose's final months, her handwritten note expressing confusion and fear, and the sophisticated gaslighting campaign Madison and Frank had used to gain control of her finances. Unlike previous family confrontations where I had been dismissed and attacked, the courtroom provided a forum where truth was valued over family loyalty. Madison and Frank's defense attorney attempted to portray their crimes as family financial management gone wrong, but the evidence was too overwhelming to support any narrative other than deliberate, calculated elder abuse. The federal prosecutors had documented a clear pattern of predatory behavior that could not be explained away as misunderstanding or good intentions. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Madison was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, while Uncle Frank received 22 years due to his leadership role in the criminal enterprise. Both were ordered to pay complete restitution to all victims, including the nearly $2 million stolen from Grandmother Rose. But the legal victory, while satisfying, was only part of my journey toward healing and rebuilding my life. The family relationships destroyed during this fight could not be restored by court decisions, and I had to confront the reality that most of my relatives had chosen to support criminals rather than seek justice for an elderly abuse victim. However, the trial had also revealed surprising sources of support and new family connections. During the proceedings, I met Patricia Williams, the granddaughter of another victim who had been fighting a similar battle for justice. Patricia and I formed an immediate bond based on shared experiences of family betrayal and determination to protect vulnerable elderly people. "You realize we are basically sisters now," Patricia told me after the sentencing hearing. "We have been through something together that most people cannot understand. That creates a family bond stronger than blood." Patricia was right. Through this ordeal, I had discovered that family is not just about shared genetics, but about shared values and mutual support. The relatives who had abandoned me over money had never really been family in any meaningful sense. Agent Mitchell and Agent Kim also remained in my life beyond their professional obligations. They invited me to speak at law enforcement training sessions about recognizing elder abuse patterns, turning my painful experience into a tool for protecting other families. "Your case has become a model for how financial elder abuse investigations should be conducted," Agent Kim told me. You have helped train hundreds of investigators who will be better equipped to help other families facing similar situations. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter that provided the final piece of emotional healing I needed. David, Uncle Frank's son, who had initially believed his father's lies, reached out to apologize and rebuild our relationship. "Scarlett, I owe you a profound apology," David wrote. "I let family loyalty blind me to obvious truth, and I failed to support you when you were fighting for justice. I understand now that you were the only family member brave enough to do the right thing, regardless of personal cost." David's letter opened the door for reconciliation with several family members who had been misled by Madison and Frank's manipulation but were now ready to acknowledge the truth. While not all family relationships could be repaired enough, healing occurred to rebuild a smaller but more authentic family circle. The financial restitution from Madison and Frank's conviction allowed me to establish the Rose Memorial Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating families about elder abuse prevention and providing resources for abuse victims. Grandmother Rose's money, which had been stolen to fund her abuser's luxurious lifestyle, was now being used to protect other elderly people from similar exploitation. Working with the foundation also provided a sense of purpose that helped transform my pain into positive action. Instead of being consumed by bitterness about family betrayal, I channeled my energy into preventing other families from experiencing similar trauma. 1 year after the trial, I participated in a ceremony where Agent Mitchell presented me with a civilian commendation for my role in exposing the elder abuse ring. Standing in the same FBI office where I had first learned about the scope of Madison and Frank's crimes, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. "Miss Scarlett, your courage in pursuing justice despite family pressure and personal attacks protected countless potential victims," Agent Mitchell said during the presentation. "Law enforcement cannot solve these crimes without brave family members willing to speak up for vulnerable relatives." The ceremony was attended by Patricia David Harold, Detective Santos, and several other people who had supported me throughout this difficult journey. Looking around the room, I realized that I had indeed found my true family people who valued justice over comfort, truth over convenience, and protection of the vulnerable over preservation of false peace. As I left the FBI office that day, I thought about Grandmother Rose and how proud she would have been to see justice finally served. Her handwritten note expressing fear and confusion had been the catalyst for exposing a criminal enterprise that had victimized multiple families. Her suffering had not been meaningless. It had become the foundation for protecting other elderly people from similar exploitation. The path to justice had cost me relationships with family members who valued money over morality, but it had also revealed the strength of character I possessed and connected me with people who shared my commitment to doing what was right, regardless of personal cost. Today, when people ask me about my experience fighting family financial crimes, I tell them that seeking justice was the hardest thing I have ever done, but also the most important. Family loyalty should never require accepting abuse or covering up crimes. True family members support each other in doing the right thing, even when that means holding relatives accountable for their wrongdoing. The question I leave you with is this: have you ever discovered something about family members that challenged everything you thought you knew about loyalty and love? Sometimes protecting our loved ones means protecting them from other family members who would harm them. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please share it, so other families know they are not alone in these difficult situations. Hit that like button if you believe justice should matter more than false family peace. Subscribe for more real stories about finding strength in impossible situations, and comment below to tell me how you have handled family betrayal in your own life. Thank you for joining me in honoring Grandmother Rose's memory, and remember that sometimes the family we choose becomes stronger than the family we inherit. May you always have the courage to stand up for what is right, even when standing up feels impossible.